There's so many people we'd like to thank this evening for making it possible to have this forum. First of all, there are our members of the forum committee who selected the topics and the speakers. Our executive director, Mr. Marvin Gawryn, our administrative director, Eva Blackmer, and our board member, Pastor Will Rucker, spiritual director of Intersection Spiritual Community. And of course, our wonderful panelists this evening. Eva will be fielding the questions this evening that you sent to me, and Will is handling the admittance of all of you. And also he's handling the polling process, which we'll be engaged in just a few moments. To get a sense of the organization, you may want to go to your flyer that you received, and there's a place where you can hit more information about the forums, and you'll see who is on the Interfaith Council, who's on the Interfaith Forum Committee, and the members of the staff, and then all of the programs that we are happy to bring to the Southern Nevada community. The program tonight is titled The Pandemic, Spiritual Guidance, Lessons Learned, and Practical Responses. And we're hoping to hear the essential spiritual messages and coping mechanisms that our faiths are sharing with their congregations in order to help them deal with the pandemic-related stresses and losses that they're experiencing. We also hope to hear how worship services and practices may have changed over the course of the last 8 months, and then special actions that congregations are taking to serve during the pandemic. I'm going to introduce our panelists very briefly so that you get a sense of who will be speaking this evening. And if you can't already see them, if you go to the right-hand corner, upper right-hand corner of your screen and hit gallery view, you should be able to see all of the panelists. Our first panelist tonight will be Rabbi Cookie Olshine of congregation near Tamid, and she will be representing Judaism. Rabbi Olshine is replacing this evening our dear Rabbi Akselrad, who called me this morning to report that he had just tested positive for the COVID virus. So our prayers go out to him, and we will say a prayer for him in just a moment. So we especially thank Rabbi Olshine for being with us tonight. Then if, as you're being called, if you'll raise your hand, Zen Master Ji Hang of the Zen Center of Las Vegas is representing Zen Buddhism. Dr. Yupinder Singh from the Baba Deep Singh Ji Gurdwara is representing the Sikh faith. Elder Todd Larkin, a member of the Area 70, is representing the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And Mr. Gawryn, Marvin Gawryn, is the executive director of the Interfaith Council, and he will be representing the multi-faith perspective. Now, the purpose of the forums are basically threefold. The first is to hear the real teachings of the faiths that are represented and to hear what those people believe directly. Second is to meet the people of different faiths. And third is to visit different houses of worship. We've done all three things now for the last 33 years, except this year because of, well, COVID. So we won't be able to see each other in person or experience the different houses of worship, but we do want to get a sense of who's here in the audience. And toward that end, we've created a poll, which will come up on the screen in just a moment. And we'd love to have you hit the proper button according to how you identify with regard to your religious identity. And you can hit more than one if you like. We only have 10 buttons because that's all that the program would permit. So I'm going to read them. And if you belong to one of these groups, please hit the button and then we'll find out who's here in just a moment or two. We have ancient, and that would be indigenous to the United States, pagan, or Roma. The next grouping would be atheists, humanists, spiritual, not religious. The next would be the Baha'i faith. The next would be Buddha. The next would be Christian or Christ-based, and that would be Catholicism, Orthodox, Protestants, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Then we also have Hindu, Islam, Judaism, and Sikh. And our other category is Family Federation for World Peace, Religious Science, Christian Science, Scientology, Spiritualists, Unitarian Universalism, the Urantia book, and others. And you might also consider multi-faith in that group as well. If you've hit your button, your choice, then please hit submit, and we'll find out who's here in just a couple of moments. Format of the program, it goes like this. Each of our panelists have a total of 7 minutes to make their presentation. When the egg timer, which is going to be set, hits 6 minutes, you'll hear it go off, and they'll know that they have 1 more minute to wrap up. And they've all agreed to that little rule, I guess is what we could call it. They're going to speak in order of the brochure that you received online. We'll begin with Judaism. They're going to, in between their presentations, we're going to take another poll having to do with how COVID has affected you. So that's something that we'll enjoy, seeing how that, I don't know if we'll enjoy it, but we'll be interested to hear how COVID has affected everyone. After the questions, after the presentations and the polling, we'll have our questions and answers. And we ask that you go to the Q&A section and write your questions there. I will say that if you direct a question to an individual panelist, you're more likely to have that question answered than if you were to ask the question of the entire group. We don't have a whole lot of time on any count, so that would be the best way. And Eva will be fielding those questions to me. So, Will, can you show us what the results of who is here? Okay, so we have 3% are from the ancient group, 5% from atheist, humanist, spiritual, not religious, 14 from the Baha'i faith, 8% from the Buddhist faith, 55% from the Christian or Christ-based religions, 2% from Hindu, 5% from Islam, 22% from Judaism, 3% from the Sikh faith, and I lost, and then 13% from other. So we have a very, very diverse group here this evening. Thank you all for participating. Ground rules are as follows. First of all, we assume that our religious beliefs are our most deeply held beliefs, and out of mutual respect, we don't try to convert or proselytize. We're here to learn and to share, not to challenge or to debate. We speak only for ourselves, and we don't interpret another's faiths or beliefs. And if there is a situation where we may disagree, we simply agree to disagree. At this time, I'd like to offer a prayer for Rabbi Akselrad, his family, and his congregation. Thy name is my healing, O my God, and remembrance of thee is my remedy. Nearness to thee is my hope, and love for thee is my companion. Thy mercy to me is my healing and my succor in both this world and the world to come. Thou verily art the all-bountiful, the all-knowing, the all-wise. And though we are miles apart, we ask now that we feel the presence of the one that created us all as we share what we believe. So we'll begin with Rabbi Cookie Olshine, who will be representing Judaism. For 11 years, Rabbi Olshine was a civil litigation lawyer in Las Vegas. She was inspired to go to rabbinical school, which she attended for 5 years. After her ordination 12 years ago, she has practiced in Austin, Texas, and then in Palm Beach, Florida. She is now serving at Congregation near Tamid in Henderson as the resident rabbinic scholar and is focusing primarily on adult education and special projects. And she's also writing a book about the intersection between Jewish law and the law that we practice here in the United States. So with that, Rabbi.
Thank you, Alita. So it's hard to go first, but I'm going to give it my best shot. We were asked to speak about dealing with pandemic-related stresses and losses from within our faith tradition, and certainly prayer is one of the ways that we do so. It's traditional to use healing prayers within our worship, and during this time, there have been many creative versions of healing prayers that have been written. I want to share with you one of those prayers. It's called Hashkivenu, and it's the prayer that we say as we lay down our heads at night to go to sleep, hopefully, to wake up tomorrow to life renewed. And so I'll read you the creative translation of Hashkivenu, beginning with just a little bit of the Hebrew. Hashkivenu Adonai l'shalom v'ha'amidenu shomrenu l'chaim. Let us lay down in peaceful breath and with quiet mind, guided to a restful sleep that refreshes our energy and fills us with food for our lives. And let the stars be spread above our home of heavenly warmth. Release us from agony, the agony of uncertainty, guided by wise and sure counsel, cutting through the noise of shifting voices to hear your eternal message. Be our personal protective barrier against invisible and encroaching enemies. Not only the virus, but our own doubts and anxieties, boredom, inner unrest, and turmoil in our homes. Let us not redirect our own fear toward those we love in the form of anger, criticism, withdrawal, or impatience. Let social distancing not lead us to being socially distant. As we strive to protect one another, let your divine protection surround us and fill our spirits. Because you, O God, guard and watch over us in our homes and when we must leave our homes. You guard and watch over frontline healthcare workers. You guard and watch over all essential workers who feed, clean, provide, and sustain. You make miracles of human decency and hope arise in our souls and spread throughout the world. Let our hope and humanity, caring and health continue to bloom today and every day until our whole world is whole again. Baruch atah Adonai haporez sukat shalom aleinu ve'al kol amo Yisrael ve'al Yerushalayim ve'al kol ha'olam. Blessed are you, Adonai, who weaves the heavens like a blanket over us, bringing peace, healing, and wholeness to the people of Israel, Jerusalem, and indeed the entire world. And so I start today with that prayer to give you an example of some of the creativity that has been going on in the Jewish community, taking our traditional prayers that we recite each and every day and interpreting them through the lens of this pandemic. Personally, I have been talking to my congregants both in West Palm Beach and here in Las Vegas about trying meditation and creating a practice of gratitude where maybe they did not have one before. And indeed trying very hard to find the COVID silver linings, as I call them, because there are silver linings from this pandemic. if we but look for them. You see, I think that in our practice of Judaism, which we call, one of the strategies we use is called relational Judaism, based on building relationships with one another and trying to find the holy within each person. You know, we've had to be a little more intentional about being in relationship with each other. And so we are doing so by trying to incorporate modern ways of living into some of our ancient practices. So there's been a requirement that we have 10 people present during our worship, which we call a minyan to say certain prayers. And because of COVID, there have been some legal questions through the Jewish legal system, we call halacha, where we've had to address this question and say, does it count if you have 10 Zoom screens, for example? Can you make a minyan with 10 Zoom screens? Well, in the liberal practice of Judaism, the Reform movement, which is where I am from and what Rabbi Akselrad practices as well and Congregation Ner Tamid does, we have decided, yes, that 10 Zoom screens, 10 human beings counts as a minyan in these emergency times. On the more orthodox end of the practice spectrum in Judaism, they have not made that choice for themselves. And so instead, many Orthodox Jews are gathering in small groups in backyards, 10 at a time in their neighborhoods, because they don't take on the use of technology the same way that we do as we practice our liberal Judaism. Congregation Ner Tamid and many congregations in the liberal perspective, we've been streaming our worship for years and years and years. And so it wasn't so much of a transition for the congregation as an entity, but it was a transition for our community members. You see, most people thought of our streaming as simply being there in case you were sick. Not a lot of people took advantage of it. And now people have come to appreciate the convenience of being able to connect with their Jewish community online, either through YouTube or Facebook Live or through Zoom. And this happened overnight for many people in March. They suddenly realized they were not going to be going to Friday night services and had to sort of figure out, how were we going to adapt? How are we going to change to this new normal, this new reality? Part of that new reality is Zoom bar mitzvahs, Zoom bat mitzvahs, Zoom funerals, and Shiva minyanim, that first week after one of our loved ones dies, where we gather together and support each other. And I even have several colleagues who are doing Zoom weddings, depending upon their state's law. But really, this has been a challenge. Even with wonderful technology like Zoom, for some of my conservative colleagues who do use some technology, they actually had to approach the Zoom headquarters and say that for the High Holy Days, they needed a 48-hour window without Zoom turning itself off, because the way they practice their Judaism, they can't embrace technology during our High Holy Days. And so they got special dispensation from Zoom, the company, to turn a Zoom room link on, to open a sacred Zoom room, as you might call it, and leave it open for a full 48 hours to allow for conservative Jews who needed that in order to use the Zoom technology to pray in their own ways. The last part of the question that I was given was, what kind of special actions has our congregation taken?
Rabbi, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the egg timer has had her way.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I did not hear it. My apologies. I heard it earlier, but I did not hear it this time.
That's fine. Thank you so much. Sure. At this time, I'd like to ask Will if he can show the questions for the polling that we're going to take now about how COVID has affected you in the audience. So if you'll answer, have you or a friend or family member had COVID? Do you know anyone who has died from COVID? Has the pandemic diminished any of these factors in your life? select all that apply. Your faith in God, your physical health, your mental health, your financial security, your employment, your connection to others. So we hope that you will submit your answers now, and we'll see the results in a little while. We're very happy to have as our next speaker, Zen Master Ji Hang from the Zen Center of Las Vegas. Zen Master Ji Hang received Inca from the famous Korean Zen master Sin Song in 2002. He leads retreats globally, and he is the guiding teacher of communities in Las Vegas, Madison, and Topeka. So tonight he will be representing Zen Buddhism, and we're pleased to hear your presentation.
Thank you very much for the invitation to everyone here. The pandemic, okay. After having formally practiced meditation for over 3 decades, I found that one's mental attitude in daily life is the most influential factor in establishing peace and equanimity. External conditions existing outside ourselves, such as environmental concerns, physical health, emotional well-being, marital relationships, family and career, can only be successful when approached from a very fine, still point, a not moving center, a place that exudes inner peace. It is analogous to becoming the fulcrum in a grandfather clock. Everything is moving, but you stay centered and still. This is a state of mind where calmness serves as an anchor, guiding our everyday activities. Compassion, loving kindness, and tolerance is possible even in the midst of this global pandemic. To that end, in Buddhism, time-honored techniques have been handed down over centuries in meditation monasteries. They are designed to neutralize anxieties and fears that are especially prevalent now during these challenging times. More about those techniques in a moment. One of the tenets of Zen teaching is to be aware of how thoughts and feelings continually arise and impact our 24-hour day. If we remain diligent in observing this process alone, we learn to let go of our all-consuming mind meanderings. When not attached to thoughts, we have no time to get caught up on things. In other words, the mind is always flowing like a river. Nothing becomes stagnant. Everything is clear and perceptible. When we stop flowing, our minds then become foul like stagnant water. People are often intrigued by a Buddhist approach to life, but find it somewhat enigmatic. They have trouble translating the message into a form that is applicable to their faith and in their daily lives. What is essential is the ability to do one thing at a time without looking aside or allowing for any distractions. Peace and equanimity are not possible when we are engaged in one thing while at the same time diverting ourselves with a lot of other concerns, daily concerns. When performing the simplest acts without digressing attention to these extraneous things or looking away from what is being focused on, fears and attachments then increasingly drop away. Suddenly, we become even more deeply focused. Our main issue then during this time of COVID-19 is to find a way to deepen this undistracted, one-pointed attention. Now, when I say these things, it could be the most simple act of driving your car, of doing the dishes, of vacuuming your carpet. All of those without diversion and just simply being present to that act is also an act of compassion and loving kindness for the gift of life that we all have been given. Perennial questions such as whether the world is eternal or whether the world is finite are put on the back burner when we do this. Finding ourselves focused on the precision and intelligence found in each and every moment, moment by moment, becomes the salient point and indeed the reason for our existence. Ladies and gentlemen, and all guests, your true legacy to this world is not in your degrees and not in your material possessions or what you have accomplished scholastically. Your true legacy to this world is how you live your life and keep your mind moment by moment by moment. The pandemic, certainly loss of family members, loss of income, and structural changes in our children's education are of great concern worldwide. The existential,
you have one more minute.
The existential reality of the pandemic, with its insidious destruction of human life, is daunting. This, however, makes it all the more important to stay focused on the pragmatic aspects of daily life. When moved around by the daunting daily information regarding COVID-19, breathing becomes shallow and consciousness becomes scattered. It seems like the whole day is spent jumping from one thought to the next. The Buddha taught tranquility and wisdom in that order. First, establish tranquility, and from there, wisdom will appear of itself. That being said, one of the aforementioned techniques of Zen practice is an emphasis on deep diaphragmatic breathing. To reduce the stress experience of the pandemic, first and foremost, is to begin lengthening breathing, particularly the exhalation, which with each breath, exhale clear down to the lower abdomen. When done correctly, you should feel a tautness there. That is a good thing. That is how we should breathe. Wide, expansive, smooth, and calm. An embryonic breath similar to how we all breathe when first born. Practicing this breathing totally and completely in all places and at all times, the rapid whirlwind random thinking process calms down considerably. It is a physiological phenomenon.
Thank you, Zen Master.
Okay.
We'll have to have you continue in the Q&A section, but thank you so much. That was lovely.
Welcome.
My little egg timer is not being loud enough tonight. She's naughty. Now she's going to ring for me. So at this point, we'd like to see the results of our first poll on the questions related to the pandemic. So have you or a friend or family member had COVID? Yes, 68%. No, 32%. So 2/3 of us have. Do you know anyone who has died from COVID-19? Yes, 44%. No, 48%. Unsure, 8%. It's pretty much split there on the yeses and the nos. Has the pandemic diminished any of these factors in your life? Faith in God or a higher power? Only 4%. Physical health? 23%. Mental health, 37%, or 1/3 of us. Financial security, 13%. Food security, 7%. Employment, 14%. connectedness to others, 89%. So nearly all of us are feeling the diminishment of our connections to everyone. And a third of us have had mental health challenges during this time. Thank you all for participating. I'm now pleased to introduce Dr. Yupinder Singh, who is a member of Baba Deep Singh Gurdwara. He is a physician who is at the forefront of helping patients recover from COVID-19 and developing policies to protect staff while they provide care. As a Sikh, he is serving the unprecedented and varied needs of those affected by the pandemic. Tonight, as always, he is representing the Sikh faith. Dr. Singh.
A very good evening, everyone. It is a very different, but still a very satisfying feeling to get together on the Zoom platform. I would like to thank the Interfaith Forum and Alida's leadership and everyone involved in making this happen. Not even the pandemic can dampen her spirits. Kudos to the team for passion, for continuing the interfaith dialogue. I feel humbled to represent the Sikh faith. I'm not a priest, and so I feel honored to be sharing the virtual dais with esteemed faith leaders. During these unprecedented last several months of COVID pandemic, it is but natural, as we saw on that poll, that people start to have questions and doubts about God's role in this. Why did God let this happen? What is our fault? What did we do to deserve this? Sikh faith tells us that God has nothing to do with it. None of us are immune to pandemics, earthquakes, bad things, or good things for that matter, happen for the same reason that anything happens. From our holy scripture, Jo rakhe mehtari barak ko, taise hi prabh. God, just like the mother takes care of the children, same way the God takes care of the whole world. So if that is the case, then the pandemics are there, then what can I do? How do I cope with it? Sikh faith is very clear. So-called good things and bad things are part and parcel of the life. Remember, adversity is random. We have no control over that. Neither should we have any illusion of that. What we have control over is how we deal with it, how we handle it, what do we do during these times. Sukh dukh jan samdrishta. Transliteration, one who looks upon happiness and sadness as one and the same thing is not affected. When these unforeseen things happen, Sikh faith teaches us Jake dukh sukh sam kar jape tako kara kaha beape. Transliteration, if we take pleasure and pain in the same vein, then we don't get any anxiety. Important point to remember is that everyone gets sick, and that includes people of faith. Jo nar dukh mein dukh nahi mane, that person who in the midst of pain does not feel pain, who treats gold and dirt alike, that person is a blessed one. So these things, Sikhs don't let these things bother them. Sikhs stay in Chaddi Kala, as we say, meaning state of bliss and a state of gratitude every moment of life. Understand one thing, whether a child is born or there is a death in the Sikh family, we say the same prayer, Anand Sahib, Song of Bliss. Not that because we are short on prayers, we have 1430 pages of over 5,800 hymns in our holy scriptures. No stories. Such is a state of mind of a Sikh, or at least we try to get to that state. How religious practices have changed, like everyone else. Many services became online. The unique thing is, we believe that in Sikhism, we believe that God is not restricted to the four walls. God resides in its creation, the whole of humanity. You don't have to depend on priests for prayers, ceremonies. Any Sikh and every Sikh is perfectly capable of performing all the responsibilities ascribed to a priest. So Sikhs started singing hymns themselves. Remember one thing, to sing in perfect melodious note is not what is required. What is important is the love we enshrine in our heart for the Lord. What we did as a Sikh faith for the community. Sikhs have three principles: earn your honest living, meditate on the name of the Lord, and service to the humanity. For Sikhs, the whole humanity is one race. Manas ki jaat, sabe eke pehchan bo. Sikhs have followed what our masters taught and did in practice. 7th Guru opened hospitals. 8th Guru took care of the patients himself. Not much different from other faith-based organizations, Sikhs offered free food, sanitizing services. Food banks were open to all. Even before the crisis, Sikh Gurdwaras offered the food to anyone and everyone. Golden Temple offers more than 100,000 meals every single day, irrespective of anyone's belief system. But with COVID crisis, we doubled down on those efforts. Places where COVID was rampant and people were afraid to go and help, Sikhs raced towards them. Those rooms, there are rooms in the Sikh temples, those rooms were converted to hostels so that the frontline people, like doctors and nurses, could stay in them because they were afraid to go back to the home and affect their family members.
Dr. Singh, that's 6 minutes.
Sikhs see serving humanity, the needy, the poor, the sick, as serving Lord. Remember, God manifests in his creation. God is working through these heroes. What I know is some pandemics are because of the viruses and the dangerous bugs, but some are man-made. When we mistrust others and try to prove that one religion is superior than the other, when we don't respect nature, when we don't believe in science, believe me, we may not be able to stop all the pandemics. But with all the faith leaders together, all the religions working together, the strength, with that combined strength, we can overcome COVID and any other pandemic. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh. That was a perfect estimation of another minute. Really good. Okay, now we're going to take our second poll, and we'll show the results after our next speaker. Will, can you post that poll questions? Okay, has your faith or belief system been a solace to you during the pandemic? Please rate on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the most solace. These answers, by the way, are anonymous. Nobody's going to see your responses to these questions. Have you grown closer to your higher power or the divine God, goddesses, spirit during the pandemic? Please rate on a scale of 1 to 5 if you've grown closer. And finally, are you hopeful, or how hopeful are you for the future? Please rate again on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being very hopeful. And please submit when you're finished. Okay, at this time, I'd like to invite Elder Todd Larkin, a member of the 70 of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, to make his presentation. Mr. Larson is a retired real estate developer who is active in the Las Vegas community and his church, which he has also served as a bishop and as a stake president. As an Area 70, he supervises church activities in the Southwest, in parts of New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. He also serves on the church's Native American Committee. Elder Larkin.
Thank you, Aliyah. And I'm just grateful to the Interfaith Forum of Southern Nevada for giving me this opportunity. I'm humble and I'm honored. And I hope that I can say something that will be useful or valuable to some of you who are listening here today. When COVID-19 hit, the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints were prepared in a miraculous and marvelous way. 2 years before COVID-19, the leader of our church, whom we sustain as a prophet, suggested that perilous times were ahead, and he assigned 2 members from every congregation to minister to each family in the congregation. So every member of the congregation was given an assignment to work with somebody else and given a list of families that they would minister to and keep in touch with and watch over. And we spent 2 years doing that prior to COVID-19. About a year and a half before COVID-19, our prophet felt like we needed to do more in our homes. We reduced the length of our worship services by an hour and replaced that with an hour of the study of our scriptures and sacred writings in our own homes. And we had done that for a year and a half before COVID-19. When COVID-19 struck, we had to shut down our gatherings completely. But between our ministers visiting all of our members and our expanded study in our own homes, we were able to keep in contact with other members of the church, fulfill our social needs, and continue our study and learning about the things that we have faith in and that we believe. And that was a marvelous blessing and a great gift to everyone. For over 5 months, we had no meetings at all. We began to have meetings with smaller groups of our congregations in September. We've expanded in October since the governor allowed us to expand. And today, though we're not holding our regular gatherings the way we did before, we're able to hold many of them. And it's been a wonderful, rejoicing reunion for our people to come and be together again. As was mentioned, I work with many of the Native Americans in the Southwest. I supervise all of our congregations on the Navajo and Hopi reservations and many of the other surrounding Native American groups, and all of our congregations in the surrounding areas in Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. In March, the very first person tested positive for the COVID-19 virus on the Navajo reservation. Within a month, the per capita rate of infection on the Navajo Nation quickly became the highest in the United States. Tribal leaders were forced to keep people almost constantly in their homes, making it difficult to get food and necessary supplies. I was able to rally our humanitarian services and a number of other charitable organizations, and we provided food, water, medical supplies, beds for our makeshift hospitals, and even outfitted a refrigeration trailer for a morgue because there was no room in the morgues on the reservation. And that was a wonderful experience. In September, I realized that people hadn't had a chance to gather firewood. Now, many people in the United States would be surprised to learn that there are places in the United States where 40% of people don't have running water or electricity, and many of those are on the Navajo Nation. The bulk of the people heat their homes with wood stoves and cook their food with wood stoves. I didn't know how to get wood, and I began to pray to a higher power, asking what to do. In the midst of my prayers, a massive storm struck northern Utah and blew over tens of thousands of trees. Many people lost 30 and 40-year-old trees that had been in their yard for years. They landed on their homes and fences and caused terrible damage. And it was a significant tragedy. In the middle of it, I felt impressed that it would be great if we could move those fallen trees to the Navajo reservation 300 miles away. but they were quickly being chipped and taken to landfills, and I only had a few days to organize the effort. I called lots of people, and they told me it was impossible and hopeless. I called 4 of my counterparts in the church in the Salt Lake area, and within a matter of 2 days, we had 10,000 people damaged by the storm, turning their tragedy into a blessing for others. 10,000 people wandered through the streets, collecting every single tree that they could find, sawing it into usable sizes and depositing it in distribution sites. I called the Utah Trucking Association, and over 100 people volunteered to drive that wood to the Navajo reservation. We filled a 3-acre lot to 7 or 8 feet deep. I wondered how we would ever distribute it across the 300-mile width of the Navajo reservation. The wood was gone in 2 or 3 days. And we reached the most distant corners of the Navajo reservation. I witnessed a miracle. I prayed, and God created a disaster for some people, and the goodness of their hearts turned that disaster into a miracle for thousands of others. And this summer, no one will go without heat on the Navajo reservation. I feel blessed to have had the opportunity to witness and gain greater faith from that experience, and to know that even in our darkest hours, there are powers that watch over us, that care for us, that are real. I witnessed a miracle, and there was no longer room for any doubt in my life.
That's 6 minutes, Elder.
We relied significantly on prayer in our faith and in our religion. We recognize God as a higher power and as a father of our spirits. In his love, we find solace, and we find the strength to endure and find our way through whatever tragedy, and have come to learn that the greatest human happiness that we will ever experience will not be in getting the things that we want and feel like we should have, but the greatest happiness that we ever experience is in the capacity that we gain to love and care and cherish other people. We learn that first in our families, and to the extent that we can learn it in the world, we discover the strength and the ability to make it through any crisis. And no matter how desperate and discouraging life may become, we are always able to be happy. Thank you so much for taking time to listen to some small message from me.
Thank you very much, Elder. That was very inspiring. I appreciate it. And what a beautiful story about the wood. It's amazing. So now, Will, if you will post the results of the second poll. Has your faith or belief system been a solace to you during this pandemic? Rate on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being most. 73% of us said 5. It's been a great solace. 17% 4, 9% on a scale of up to 3, and the least at 1%. So apparently for most people, their faith has been a great solace during this time. Have you grown closer to your higher power during the pandemic? Please rate on a scale of 1 to 5. 36% said closer, 37% are at almost closer. No change, 27%. And no one feels more distant at this point. And how hopeful are you for the future? Rate on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being very hopeful. Nearly 60% of us feel very hopeful. 26% are feeling somewhat, feeling neutral, 10%, and discouraged, 1%. So there we go. Thank you all for participating. And our last speaker for the evening is Mr. Marvin Gawryn. Marvin is the executive director of the Interfaith Council of Southern Nevada. He's a family therapist whose approach has been shaped by his multi-faith and contemplative practices. He'll share how spiritual resources of our traditions can moderate the social and psychological stresses of the pandemic. Marvin and I have been friends for a long time, as friends and as co-workers on the council. So Marvin, representing the multi-faith perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Alita. Much appreciate the introduction, and I much appreciate the wonderful sharing that all of the other panelists have graced us with. Very inspiring, very uplifting, every single one. So I come as a therapist on the front lines, talking with people who are struggling, grappling with these circumstances. And my sense is that there are three broad sets of social and psychological stresses in this unprecedented situation that we're in. One is a profound sense of social isolation for many people. Secondly, the loss of normal routines and structures, the loss of sort of framework of our lives for many people, which results in a sense of disorientation, feeling dislocated, almost sort of floating out in the ether a little bit, is a second kind of stress. And a third kind is sort of a background fear, apprehension, that's there much more constantly these days, and it takes the form of the fear of getting sick and maybe dying, and a sense of sort of imminent threat, and not only for ourselves, but having fear for those that are important to us, especially older folks. So, and then another kind of apprehension that's kind of free floating out there is whether we will actually be able to get back to some sense of normal, after 7 or 8 months and a prospect of several more months of this abnormal situation. Will we be able to return to what we had before? So these are some of the stresses and psychologically, socially, I hear from folks. But what I'd like to focus on primarily are three kind of broad categories of resources that all of our faith traditions have. And my background is some 30 years in the interfaith movement, and also 45 plus years as a therapist. And so the three categories, in a sense, one is personal spiritual practices, which have been talked about today. Secondly, to some extent also talked about today, is spiritual community relationships, and tapping into those and really adapting those to the conditions that we're in. And thirdly, the very rich resources from the history and the great teachings, the great teachers and the scriptures of our traditions. So I'm going to say just a little bit about each one of those today. First, personal spiritual practices. Very important for me is the goal on a daily basis to actually move into an interior encounter with the divine, with however we understand God, spirit, higher reality, however we conceptualize it in our tradition. But to engage in meditation, to engage in worship or adoration, a kind of immersion in the presence of the divine, and also to engage in what's commonly understood as prayer or dialogue, or practicing the presence of God, kind of interior conversation. And I think it's just really important to focus on whatever methodologies from our traditions we can bring to bear on our sense of isolation. That's very nourishing and very grounding, and brings a sense of peace in response to the apprehension in this situation. So personal spiritual practices, number one. And number two, nurturing the spiritual community relationships we have. And Brother Todd, I just loved your stories. And I love the tradition of the Latter-day Saints, that how quick we can be to adapt, either by phone, by Zoom, by FaceTime, virtual media, a different kind, but to move into regular and daily, if possible, virtual contacts with the members of our spiritual communities, to do that on a real regular basis is very antidoting to the sense of isolation and also to the sense of loss of structure. So schedule appointments where you visit with people using these various media, and seek support for yourself, especially if you're struggling. But in addition, really think about how you can be of service and support and encouragement to others in your community and outside of your community who might be struggling or vulnerable. Those are important and rich activities to be engaged in. And if you are struggling, certainly get in touch with those who are leaders or spiritual ministers in your various communities. So spiritual community, personal spiritual practice, spiritual community. And then thirdly, get systematic about accessing the rich resources of our various spiritual traditions. Read the primary sources, the scriptures, find the most modern adaptations, videos, or more modern adaptations of the resources from our various traditions. Pick up spiritual biographies, histories in the religious tradition that you're part of, secondary writers. Think about them. Try to apply those resources from the tradition in the unusual circumstances, the life and circumstances that we're in. So that's really most of what I wanted to share. And the general suggestion is be very intentional about structure and habit in your life, because so much of structure and so much of habit has been disruptive. Be intentional about establishing structure and habit in terms of personal spiritual practice, relationship connections, keeping them steady, and tapping the religious resources of your tradition. So actively engage with your situation. And I think the last thing I'll do is share a little bit. Probably the tradition I've been most engaged in is
Marvin, this is your 6 minutes.
Thanks. A text called the Ranch Book, and I'm going to share a passage from that text, and hopefully you can sort of see that. Jesus portrayed the profound surety of the God-knowing mortal when he said, "To the God-knowing spiritual seeker, what does it matter if all things earthly crash? Temporal securities are vulnerable, but spiritual sureties are impregnable. When the flood tides of human adversity beat about the mortal soul, you may rest in the assurance that there is one inner bastion, the citadel of the spirit, which is absolutely unassailable. At least this is true of every human being who has dedicated the keeping of his or her soul to the indwelling spirit of the eternal God. Such spirit-born individuals are so remotivated in life that they can calmly stand by while their fondest ambitions perish and their keenest hopes crash. They positively know that such catastrophes are but the redirecting cataclysms which wreck one's temporal creations preliminary to the rearing of the more noble and enduring realities of a new and more sublime level of universe attainment." So thanks for the opportunity, and it's an honor to share and serve with all of you here in this panel and with all of you in the audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marvin. That was a beautiful quotation that I'm sure we can all take to the bank. At this time, we will begin our question and answer portion, which gives me an opportunity to learn to dance on Zoom. And so here we go. We're going to start with, since Rabbi started us off, we're going to start our Q&A with Zen Master Ji Hang, and we're going to ask this question of all of our panelists. And the question is, does your faith group feel the restrictions resulting from COVID to be a threat to religious freedom? If so, in what ways?
And that question first from me.
First for you, and we're going to ask everybody if you could take about a minute for this question.
Sure. do I begin though, is my question.
You begin, yes, you begin.
Zen Buddhism comes from a long history of the Hermetic style of contemplation and meditation. And so I actually personally, and I instill this within the Sangha members, to not consider this to be any kind of a change in what they would do normally in their prayer or their meditation structure. Said another way, it's like, I like the quote that was just intended, that habit and structure are the keynotes to our life. So a few years ago, I completed a 90-day solo retreat. 90 days. Brought a lot of brown rice with me. Luckily had a refrigerator and put a little bit of ice cream in there as a treat. And it was very austere. And when I went to Zen Master Teacher for some instruction, the advice was, let the schedule be your teacher. Let the schedule be your teacher. So this is important, that we engage, I think all of us during this pandemic, to a daily routine, and let our daily life be pragmatic in the sense of like looking at each hour of each day and the job that we put in front of us to accomplish. It could be housework, it could be paying bills, it could be dropping off stuff at the post office or at our bank. All of those things should have a structure to it. That'll help us with this getting through the pandemic in a very reliable form. People buried. One last thing. People buried in thoughts are unable to reflect clearly. So wisdom can only come forth from a clear and quiet mind established by our daily routine.
Thank you so much, Master Ji Hang. Now the question goes to, I have to see who's next, to Dr. Singh, the same question. And the question again is, does your faith group feel the restrictions resulting from COVID to be a threat to religious freedom? If so, in what ways?
So the simple answer is, if you ask many different people, you may get different answers, but on the broader scheme of things, nobody feels that it is restricting anyone's religious freedoms. I alluded it a little bit, that the way we practice, the way we are not bound by the four walls that you have to go to a particular place and things like that. So, and everyone understands that we need to listen to the science, and that science and Sikh religion have never collided with each other. So the bigger answer in generally speaking, it has not restricted any of the religious activities.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh. Elder Larkin.
We believe that the right to gather is the very heart of religious freedom. We certainly recognized, in particular in the beginning of the pandemic, that the necessity of keeping people separated and probably limiting some of our interactions to stop the spread of the pandemic. I think we were concerned that as the essential organizations were identified in many of the emergency orders in many communities, in very few cases did they mention faith gathering as an essential part of our lives. And it is our belief that that's as essential. In the state of Nevada, people were allowed to gather in large numbers in casinos and bars long before they were allowed to gather for religious services. We see that as concerning. We certainly are very, very supportive of the government of the state of Nevada and the other states in the United States. And we want to comply with whatever that they think is necessary. But we do have a that restricting our capacity to gather puts in question somewhat our religious freedom.
Thank you very much, Elder Larkin. The question goes now to you, Marvin.
It's a very interesting question. Very interesting question. What comes to mind, Alita, is, and it's a bit of lore, that the Chinese term for crisis is made up of two characters. Crisis, one means danger and the other means opportunity. And I think, like so much of what's going on, or in times of other crisis, times of war, times of breakdown for other reasons, great financial duress, I sort of relate to it as in a kind of neutral fashion, that we can do one of two things in response to these challenges of being unable to gather. We can respond poorly, we can respond well. In the community that I'm part of, the restrictions that have come as a result of COVID have actually resulted in opening up of new opportunities that never would have happened had not COVID hit. So some of the features of this Zoom gathering allow for a certain level of intimate sharing that wasn't quite reached in our community before these conditions. So, I would simply say I don't consider it a threat. I consider it as part of the natural set of reactions and features of this situation, and how we respond to it is really flows from our religious traditions, and how to take advantage of it for the purposes that have always been part of our traditions really becomes the challenge.
Thank you, Marvin. And now, Rabbi, it's your chance to answer this question.
So I'm going to start with the Talmudic teaching. We are taught that to save a life is as if you save an entire world. And so the primacy of life is a primary concern of Jewish people. In liberal Judaism, we also understand that there is the teaching within the Torah in the book of Leviticus that talks about something called Metzorah. It's a disease that we don't really know what the disease is all about, but there were concerns both for the individual and the community at the time when this dangerous disease afflicted this spiritual community on its journey. And all of the people that had it were supposed to be set aside. They were supposed to be quarantined, is the word we would use in modern times. They were to be quarantined. They were to be separated. And there were many other times in Jewish history when quarantine was used as a way to fight disease. And so we do not believe in the liberal tradition that the restrictions from COVID are a threat to our religious freedom. We understand that we need to follow the rules of the land in which we live. It's another Talmudic concept called Dina de Malchutcha Dina, or the judgment of the kingdom, or the laws of the kingdom are the laws that apply to us. And so we have adapted to these laws and we follow them.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your answer. Okay, now we're going to ask a round of questions for individual panelists, and we'll start with Dr. Singh. We're doing this because, as I said, Rabbi started first, and then our first round was with Zen Master Zhiheng, and now we're going to start with Dr. Singh on the individuals. And the question is this, Dr. Singh: if the pandemic can be broken down into stages, what would you call or characterize the stage that we are in now as?
No, different people will take it in different stages. I think the stage we are in now, where people have got used to it, and they are kind of getting frustrated that when will this get over with? In the beginning, they were very paranoid. They will not even talk to their neighbors. And I am told that in India, they will put a signboard outside people's home if somebody had tested positive. And there were actually attacks on the frontline people that they were not letting them come to the home. So it has gone from a paranoia to acceptance, and now kind of frustration when it will get over with. So I think that will be the stage I can make up.
Okay. Thank you very much. Our next question then is for Elder Larkin. Does the prophet see an end to the pandemic in the near future?
The prophet of the Church of Christ of Latter-day Saints hasn't given a timeline for the end of the pandemic, but he has indicated to us that it will pass, that life will go back to normal at some point in time. What he's encouraged us to do is to use this time to learn and to grow, to use this time to recognize things in our lives that are unnecessary and that don't really serve a real important purpose. He's counseled us to look for things that we can unclutter from our lives so that we have more time in the future to spend with our families, to spend with the people that we love, and to spend in the service of those who have needs that are greater than our own.
Thank you very much, Elder. Our next question is for Marvin, multi-faith. And the question is, as a therapist, can you give your observation about how children are being affected during the pandemic that may be different than adults?
That's very interesting. That's a very interesting question. As you know, Alita, I think you know, we recently, and this is the last night, I'm up here with our kids and grandkids in Washington State and traveling back down to Nevada tomorrow. And I'll make an observation that's partially personal and partially sociological. I think how children are doing in response to the challenges of COVID and the pandemic have very largely to do with how their parents are doing. Because the parents create the context psychologically, emotionally for what the children are experiencing. And it makes it that much more important that parents of children tap into their spiritual resources and find a sense of mooring, a sense of peace, a sense of connection and how to sustain themselves in these trying circumstances, because then they'll have the resources to provide for their children. It's interesting. I mean, we exist within a sociological context that is society. The children exist largely within a sociological context of either school or home. And given that there are many of them in isolation, it's primarily home. So the lesson really is for the parents of the children: stay in touch with your spiritual resources, be fed yourselves, be nourished, so that you can feed and nourish your children. To me, that's the key takeaway.
Thank you very much, Marvin. This question is for Rabbi Olsheim. How do you understand God's involvement in the emergence of COVID-19?
Thank you. I get a deep philosophical question to answer while standing on one foot for less than 1 minute.
You can do it.
The truth is that it depends on if you believe that God is active in your world in a macro way, or if you believe that God is active in your world in a micro way. And I always say, and people say that wherever there are two Jews, there are at least three opinions. I add on about the one right way to believe that Judaism is supposed to believe or do something. So it depends on what your personal Jewish philosophy is about the involvement of God. I prefer to think about God as crying with us. A dear friend of mine says that God is crying with us during this pandemic. And And I also prefer to think about the idea in terms of what is our response? Where is God in the response to the pandemic? I think God is with us with respect to all of the essential workers, all of those nurses and doctors that are holding people's hands in that last moment when they take their breath, all of the people that take such loving care and kindness to bury our dead. And hopefully in all the teachers that are teaching our children under these trying times. Each one of us has an opportunity to choose how we are going to respond during this pandemic, and we can choose to respond in a godly way, or as Martin Buber, the great philosopher, would say, seeing that other person through the eyes of an I-thou relationship, as opposed to the other person being an it. So where is God, and what is God's understanding, involvement in the emergence of COVID? I'm not sure, but I know that it's my job to partner with God to respond to it.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. Our next question individual question is for Master Zen Master Ji Hang, and it is, what role does acknowledging the fear that the pandemic has brought play in coping with it?
Wonderful question. I kind of want to lean towards Einsteinian quantum physics. Regardless of all the wonderful, compassionate responses that we've heard, cause and effect are clear. So we had about 100 years ago a pandemic that claimed the lives of millions of people, and now we're in a situation that is producing a lot of suffering and a lot of loss for families. It is by not being absorbed with the outer phenomena or ephemera of everyday life that will lead us back into a context of clear mind and with regard to conditions and situations. We have to let go of all of our attachments to all of the outer structures in a certain sense, and return to that wonderful clear mind. From that clear mind, wisdom appears. I said this earlier in my talk. Otherwise, we are just having many, many opinions, and that is also valid. I'm not saying that it's wrong, but to get to that neutral point, that clear ground, requires that we absolve ourselves from all attachments to all educational structures, our upbringing, our ethnicity, and come back to this clear still point, that fulcrum that I alluded to, that is the basis of a grandfather clock. When we get to that point, it's not so difficult. But when we absolve ourselves from all of our opinions, judgments, situations, and conditions, and find that fulcrum, then from there, peace and equanimity and a response to all situations are possible, whether it be in a grand structure of, I loved Elder Larkin's story also about the wood, our true family tradition, all faiths, family tradition is, how may I help you? And so if we can embody this compassion and loving kindness in every aspect of our life, from the daily encounter with the checker at Albertsons or Vons when we're buying our groceries, an exchange that make them feel a little bit more engaged rather than robotic, then we're also fulfilling the law of all of the religious aspects of everyone here. In my heart, I believe that.
Thank you very much. Okay, this will be our last round of questions, and I'm going to give our panelists a choice of whether they'd like to answer the question that I posed, or if you would like to take a moment to give some final thoughts on the pandemic that you may not have shared with us previously. And we'll start with Elder Larkin. The question is, are considerations like wearing masks and social distancing moral responsibilities or individual rights? So you can either answer the question or say a few other words.
I think that they're both. I think that they are certainly, that we certainly have a responsibility to put others' needs before our own. And wearing a mask, while it, you know, I don't enjoy wearing a mask. Maybe some of you do. I seem to sweat inside of it, and it stifles my breathing, and I'm just anxious to get it off as quickly as I can. But if that will help me to prevent other people from suffering, I am certainly and absolutely willing to make that sacrifice and have no problem with doing so. Should we allow ourselves to be forced to do things like that? You know, I would hope that in a society where there's brotherly love, that we never even have to get to the point where we have to make decisions like that. If people around us feel uncomfortable to be around us because we don't wear a mask, I think the last thing that we would want to do in my faith, and the last thing that I would want to do in my personal life, is to refuse to wear a mask to make some kind of a statement. I would just do it because it would be a blessing to other people and to what's going on in other people's lives. And maybe if I could, one last comment.
Sure.
You know, this has been an interesting experience for all of us. You know, probably in our lifetime, nothing to compare with this has ever happened. We can all take this two different ways. We can emerge from this time thinking, boy, that was terrible and horrible, and I'm glad it's over. Or we can take this time to allow a divine reset to happen in our lives. We can take this time to stop and really try to discover and to determine what really, really matters. And I suspect, and this has been my experience, I suspect that we'll find out that a lot of the things that we were chasing after and thought were absolutely necessary and essential to our happiness really aren't. There are things that are far more powerful, that have so much greater capacity to make us happy. I would encourage everybody to seek for those things. And when this thing comes to an end, to be a different person than what went into it.
Thank you very much, Elder Larkin. So our next respondent will be Marvin. You can either take the question or say a few extra words on the subject.
I'll go ahead and take the question and try to build a little bit on what my brother Todd shared. I think this is such an unusual and remarkable set of circumstances, and I agree with you, Brother Larkin, that this is the challenge of our whole lives and our whole generation, and we will look back on it as such. And it's a challenge for us personally and individually. It's also a challenge for our religious traditions and how our traditions are going to respond and adapt. But I think it's also a tremendous challenge for our society and for our culture. And I mean our particular national cultures, whether it's in the United States or Europe or the Far East or India or wherever. But I also think it's a challenge for our slowly emerging global culture. And I'm very sort of tuned in, as many of us are, to the international interfaith arena as a growing culture unto itself. And I think we have something, and gatherings like this have something to contribute to the struggles of ethical discernment, ethical value, and how we react and how we respond to the challenges of this situation, and learning from a value sense of what matters in relation to the juxtaposition of individual needs and rights versus the needs and rights of the whole, and the love for the family of the whole, of all of humanity. How are we going to respond with an ethical response to the highest level good, right? And how do we learn to put our own personal good in abeyance to that highest common good, I think is part of the challenge for our culture and our society. And I think we'll be deciphering how we responded and what we've learned from it for decades to come after this crisis is over, actually.
Thank you very much, Marvin. We really appreciate your comments. Okay, Rabbi Olshein, if you would like to either take the question or offer some closing thoughts.
I'm going to take the question as well. Jewish law teaches us that we are forbidden to endanger ourselves and that we have an obligation to care for those within our community. So I, like basically every liberal rabbi that I know, we would not consider wearing masks to be any sort of infringement on our individual rights. And I'm not sure if we would equate it necessarily with a moral obligation. Jewish law teaches us that this is the way that Jews are supposed to behave. Now, in the liberal tradition, of course, we have a philosophy in the Reform movement that it's that our behavior is based on choice after education. The key words there, though, are after education, you get to make a choice. So I suppose you could argue, maybe it's a moral question. But Jewish law is clear that there is no question that you have an obligation to not to endanger ourselves. The other piece that I want to share with you just briefly is the idea that there have been epidemics throughout history, and our sages have commented on those pandemics, epidemics throughout the course of time. If we think about how Jewish communities responded in the time of the Talmud, which is no later than the year 600, an epidemic was considered to exist in a smaller city if 3 deaths were suffered from a known disease on 3 consecutive days. And in a larger city, 9 deaths in 3 days. So does that language sound like now? It does. Understanding that we will survive these epidemics, we will survive pandemics, but only if we take action, because Jewish law also says we have an obligation to do something in response, that we have an obligation to take care of all of the victims, as well as to prevent as best as possible, to do something to prevent the pandemic from spreading inside our community and outside. So I would just conclude by saying that as our friend from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints said so eloquently as he opened, it is clear for us as well that our forefathers sought to protect themselves through whatever ways were available from epidemics. And they used quarantine, and they used hand washing. They used anything they could to prevent the spread of a disease. So too must we.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. And now we'll hear from Zen Master Ji Hang. Would you like to take the question, or would you like to have some closing comments?
I'll take what's behind door number 2.
You'll what?
I'll take what's behind door number 2, Monty.
Oh, okay. Okay.
No, you can ask me anything.
Well, that was the question.
Oh.
Are considerations like wearing masks and social distancing moral responsibilities or individual rights? That was the question.
Moral responsibility. Absolutely, unequivocally, moral responsibility. I follow science unequivocally. Some people have many thoughts and some people have very few. What we think about and hold on to affects what we perceive and how we perceive. when we hold on neither to thought nor to anything at all within these preconceived structures, even including religion, we perceive correctly with all of our senses. Thus, the five senses that we're gifted with, seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, and smelling, become paramount. And they're heightened because we're devoid of our locking into some ideation of who and what we are as human beings. Sentient beings are numberless. We vow to save them all. This is the first of the four great vows in Buddhism. Everything in this world is vibrating at a different pace. Human beings, animals, trees. Science has proved now that trees are sentient, not in their outer structure, but in the roots. And we can go into this in depth at a different time. But when we start thinking about I, my, me, and the structure that we all create around this idea of being a human being, then we lose some of that. My Zen teacher used to say, human beings are number one bad animal. And when we look around, we see the political structures worldwide, the oligarchs and various elitist leaders or autocratic leaders. We see that it's creating human suffering at a very high pyramidic level, and it transcends down into the suffering of children being subject to nerve gas agents in Syria and elsewhere. So the pandemic is yet one more wonderful learning experience for us as human beings globally. And unless we learn from it, with close to 8 billion people now on this planet, the resources are being very, very much tapped.
And on that note, then, Master Zhihang.
Yes, sir. Yes.
I think we're concluding.
Okay.
There. Thank you for being agreeable. And so the last word goes to Dr. Singh. Same question or closing comments?
Normally, I never have the last word. But I'm a married guy, so I cannot have the last word. But I will say that regarding to the mask, one person's right should not be affecting any other person negatively. So even the people who are opposing the masks, I can understand their viewpoint because they are not sure whether the masks are giving them any protection or it is doing anything good. But believe me, CDC is doing the best it can under the circumstances. They are giving the best possible advice. This is an uncharted territory. Nobody has a roadmap to it. We are learning every single day, and we need to be adaptable and adjust accordingly. Lastly, I will say that I see this pandemic, like any other crisis, as an opportunity for the whole of humanity to come together. And we can pool our resources, be kind to the nature, and help the humanity so that we don't have to suffer and to deal with future epidemics in a more cohesive manner.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. And with that, we conclude our first forum of the season. Ordinarily, I would ask for a huge round of applause for our panelists. And I guess we can all do this for each other.
Yeah, a huge round of applause for our audience.
Yes, for our audience. Thank you very much, Marvin. We wouldn't be doing these forums if there weren't an audience who's interested in hearing. So thank you all so much for being here with us. Thank you to our panelists for their brilliant presentations and for their graciousness in submitting to the egg timer that didn't work, and in her stead, me interrupting you all. I'd also like to thank Eva for fielding questions, and our dear Will Rucker for all that he did behind the scenes with the polls and setting everything up. This has been a wonderful learning experience. So we hope to see you all next week, 7 o'clock. We'll be talking about climate change, and we have some wonderful panelists joining us there. And also at the end of the series, we have our Thanksgiving service. So with that, bravo to everybody. A lot of gratitude. Thank you very much, and good night.